for joining us here on the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the space where research meets the real world. Today, we're exploring the lived realities of First Ladies in African American churches with Dr. Shante White, a professor of mass communications at North Carolina Central University, where she also serves as coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies program. Because of the royal treatment that we give to Black pastors, many of their wives benefit from this fact because they're married to the shepherd of the church. We view First Ladies as women who are committed to God and family. But it's important to think about the fact that they're living out this commitment in the fishbowl of a church community and their larger social worlds. This week's episode features Dr. Shante White discussing her book, The First Lady, African American Pastor Wives in Their Own Words. This collection of 19 personal stories of African American pastors' wives explores how these women define and negotiate their diverse roles while balancing the expectations of their husbands, congregation, and the broader community. Dr. White, I'm so appreciative of you being here. I think one of the first things we should do is define who is or what is a first lady in an African American church setting and what their roles are.
Well, a first lady is generally someone who's married to the pastor of the church. And of course, as we get to mega churches, sometimes we have associate pastors. Smaller churches wouldn't necessarily have that, but it is the person married to the senior pastor of the church. In my research, when I started, I really tried to figure out what was the origin of this term. And I really never found it. In fact, I had to go even to the political origins. There was a president who was not married, whose niece served as the hostess for the White House. And so that's how we started with the term. And so my deduction is that probably the church is one of the few autonomous institutions that we have or had and still have in the African American community, but certainly of years gone by. It's the one that we controlled. It's the one that we ran. The pastor is the leader. We got deacons. So it's our church, and there was no influence from the outside. And so I'm assuming because there was never a thought that let alone a Black woman could possibly be in the White House, let alone a president's wife, we started to use that term. That's kind of what I am thinking. I never found anything that indicated where that originated from, but that is my thesis or guess.
You also have this dual role. You are a first lady. You are a university faculty member. So maybe you could share with us how these dual roles or positionalities influenced your motivation to write this book.
Well, I think my motivation, well, of course, as a researcher, you research out of your interest. When I first started, I started in academia. I transitioned to natural hair. So I did a whole thing on hair and Black women in hair. So then I was kind of like, okay, well, what do I do next? And this role just really interests me just as a person. So just as my role as pastor's wife. And I tell in the story how there was the kids at our first church had done these bookmarks. And so my husband got a bookmark. It was like for Christmas. And so it said to Pastor White, because that's my husband's last name. And then my bookmark was Pastor Wife. That was it. I had no name. And I thought that was so symbolic of pastors' wives' kind of role. And I do understand there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes along with that. So that's not always the case. But as we talk about that, there's little research. So you can have this really huge bio on Vernon Johns, or, you name any time of pastor that is pretty well known. And then they'll have a paragraph and they'll say, and he was married to the former so-and-so and so-and-so. And then that's it. But knowing that many of these women really invested in the ministry. And before we got to mega churches, before we got to staffs, before we got to big things, those women were working in the church. They were running and doing the bulletins and maybe even cleaning toilets and bathrooms, right? And so here are women who are really, really invested in the ministry of the church, but they were going to end up with a footnote. And so I just wanted to know more about those experiences and those women.
I think you just brought up a good point, is that really it's a role that you kind of have to marry into, but it's still elevated as a leadership role.
Yes.
How do you negotiate these two things?
I think it's a struggle if the woman is not naturally a leader. So I think for me, I grew up in the church. I'm just a church girl. So even if I hadn't married a pastor, I'm sure I would be actively involved in a local church. So that was pretty easy for me. I remember when I first got married and I had a girlfriend who she'd come to visit. And, after church, I'm talking and socializing. She was like, "Oh, Shanta, you're so in your element." Because that's what I did. Even as a layperson, I enjoyed the social aspect of it. But I do think that there is an expectation for the pastor's wives to be the leader. I think in my first church, and it's very different because one of the arguments I do make in the book is how the role is performed is really dependent upon the woman, first of all, the pastor and what his expectations are and what he's communicated, and then the church context. So I've had the fortunate opportunity to serve in two churches. The first church that my husband pastored was a very small church, and my predecessor was very active. I mean, I think she might have run the deacons meeting, right, in absence of her husband. And so when I came in, they're like, "Are you going to join the missionaries?" And I'm like, "No, I'm 27 and those women are 70. So no, that, just because that's what the pastor's wife does." And so that right there, I just said, I got to define this role for me because I don't want to be put in a box, and I don't want to do things that not necessarily that I don't want to do, because I think there are some things that I don't mind that people expect. I'll give an example. This summer, my husband had about 4 different engagements. So we had birthday parties, we had graduation parties, we had an installation. And I said, well, in your stead, I'll go to, we had a member who was turning 80 or 90. And I said, I'll just go through. And all I did was just walk through, give her a hug, took a picture. And I remember the next day her son said, that really made my mom's day. And I was like, wow, all I have to do is show up. So I don't have a problem with just showing up. So I'm not saying anything like that, but anything that is like, no, I don't want to be in the missionaries at this time at 27. I don't necessarily see myself. Nope, I'm not going to be in the nurses. Nope, I'm not going to do this. I got to figure out what I am called to do and really operate in my gifts.
What I'm hearing you say is it really depends on the church and the individual. So yes. From the background, what are some of the stereotypes or misconceptions that you've heard about first ladies and their roles and also emerged in your book through your work?
Let's see, a stereotype. Of course, she's probably always put together. She probably should be spiritually grounded, which she should. But, at the end of the day, I didn't go to seminary. Now, I do know the Bible because I do take my walk seriously and I participate in Christian education on my own, separate and apart, even before I was a pastor's wife. But every pastor's wife doesn't do that. And, that's not an expectation or shouldn't be an expectation. I think maybe sometimes the expectation might be, of course, that you exemplify Christian virtue all the time. That doesn't give account that, hey, I am human. I don't appreciate what you said. I think you're out of pocket and I'm gonna call you out on that. I think that those are some of the stereotypes. I don't know if that would be all of them, and then, of course, there's a stereotype that some people think that the pastor's wife elevates herself. So, yeah, the community puts her up on a pedestal, but she also does that, too. Because one of the things that I've often gotten, whether in both church contexts, people are like, oh, you're so humble. I'm like, yeah, are you so down to earth? And I'm like, well, yeah, what did you think I was supposed to be? I don't know exactly what that means, but it probably is grounded somewhere in, yes, the community elevates her, but then maybe there sometimes is the expectation or the stereotype that she also elevates herself.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up that story because I thought about the actress Megan Good for a while. She was married to a pastor. And in social media, the big thing that blew up were people's expectations of what kind of acting roles and how should she dress, which is, I think, again, speaks to if she was just a regular woman or an actress not married to a pastor, we wouldn't have thought about it. But right. It's the idea of being connected to this man in this spiritual, religious institution that really shifted the narrative around that. So I'm wondering if you think the expectations or responsibilities of first ladies in African-American churches are similar or different than those in other denominations where there isn't a Black leadership.
Well, I think they are, first of all, very different because even when I was pitching the book, so initially I started out, it was research that I was going to do in an academic space. And then I thought, well, I want more than 300 people to actually see this. I even got an agent, and some of the agents are the feedback. I was like, yeah, this is interesting, but can you expand this? And I was like, no, I don't want to expand it. It is about this. So it's almost like people outside of the Black community did not understand what is this concept. So I do think it is very different. I don't think that anyone else uses the term the First Lady outside of the Black community, but I do think there are some similarities in terms of a pastor's wife and the expectation of how she should behave and maybe how she should, I won't say dress, because I do think that we might be a little over the top, but, we should be modest, or we should be whatever. Your children should be well behaved. You should be at the church every time the door is open. You should be willing to serve. So I think that there probably are some similarities, but it is a very different role in the Black church.
How are the roles different?
I think, well, first of all, they don't use the concept. They don't use the term. And so I think that was why it was such a hard sell for non-academic publishers to really get. It was like, this is kind of interesting. And then they kept saying, well, who will read this? I felt like the publishers were missing out on understanding that, no, this is really big in our community and people are interested in it. So the first thing is the term is not used outside of the Black community. I think the second thing, so even though I think that the women have some similarities in terms of the expectation, I think that if you are married to a pastor, hopefully you are a Christian. So that's the first thing. And then hopefully you do exhibit some type of the fruits of being a Christian in your behavior and your speech and so on and so forth. But I don't think it's the same level of deference or level of respect that is in the Black church as in other churches. So as you said, it's almost like you're a de facto community leader, even though you've really not done anything to demonstrate community ability other than you're married to this man.
Did you think about this role before you married your husband?
No, my husband and I got engaged. He was in the ministry, so I knew he wanted to pastor. He was called to his first church while we were engaged. And in fact, the installation was May 3rd, and we got married May 30th. So I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. But I really appreciated that we figured it out together. So we're figuring out marriage together. We're figuring it out marriage and ministry together. And I'm very grateful because my husband was always, well, first of all, he had really good mentors. So I had a mentor, he had a mentor, and they were like, look, you got to figure out what this role is for you. And I remember his mentor told me, he was like, your first ministry is your husband. And when he said that, he acknowledged that I had gifts and talents, but basically he was saying that your responsibility in ministry is really to the home. And I embrace that. So that means that, not that my husband, he definitely is active and participated in child rearing, but I set the tone. So I set the organizational leadership for how the home is going to be run. And one of the things that I really appreciate about him is he never had that expectation of, you got to come with me everywhere, or you got to drag our kids all over. And now that we're actually empty nesters and he goes out and preaches, and I'm like, do you want me to come? Because we spent the last my oldest daughter's 22 years, like I haven't really done those things. So he was very clear about, I need you to be my wife, period. I don't need you to be the first lady in my home. So I think for us, we had the opportunity to really develop and define that for ourselves. Some of the women in the book, I do remember one in particular that comes to mind. They had been married a number of years, and then he went into ministry. So it was like, hold on, I didn't even sign up for this at all. At least I did know he was in ministry. And so then they had to figure out, well, what is this? And they had children at the time when he was called to pastor. So now I got to figure marriage. I got to figure out ministry. I got to figure out marriage and ministry, but I got to also figure out kids in ministry and how that happens. So my kids were born in it. That's all they know. We didn't have to really think through that beforehand. You just kind of figure it out as you go along. So no, to answer your question, I didn't necessarily think what that would mean. I will tell you, as we were talking about expectations before, but I remember, and going back to clothing, and my mother was like, one time I had on like a halter top and some shorts, and she was just like, you're not going to be able to wear shorts anymore. I was like, why would I stop wearing shorts when it's 90 degrees outside? And she basically was saying, because now you're a pastor's wife, so you should be covered and modest. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not signing on to that one.
How do you negotiate this with being a faculty member? Do they ever have any sort of connection being a researcher, or your expectations even having a job outside the home?
I think it is. For me, like I said, and I think in our case, the husband has a whole lot to play with it. Because my husband was like, you have your own professional career. I get it, right? I joke with him all the time. I was like, you should hire me. So it probably works for him, because he was like, absolutely not. You never work for me, because you'd be trying to tell me what to do. So for us, it was really clear that you have your own professional life and your own expectations. I think the biggest thing was I really understood that the girls, we have 2 girls, were my responsibility on the weekends, right? And if I had something that was going to be different, like, hey, I got a lot of grading to do, I had to let my husband know that ahead of time. So I couldn't, and I was just telling somebody, I love my daughters, neither one of them procrastinate, but I'm like, they didn't get that from me, because I was a procrastinator until I had to be responsible for other people's lives and my life too. So even in that sense, I had to tell him ahead of time, look, on Sunday, after you preach, and I know you're tired, I'm gonna let you take a nap, but I need to take these girls because I need to knock this out. And, he was always would comply with that. But again, that's something that we had to negotiate early enough for him to say, okay, I understand that this is not going to be a regular Saturday or Sunday. So that was something that was different in terms of and that's not just a faculty member. I'm saying if any professional, if I had been in any type of profession. So that's one thing that we had to negotiate. I remember our first kind of argument with our first daughter was being born, and I don't know what it was, but it was like, I need to go and do X. And I'd gone back to work, and it was a day I wasn't teaching. So I'm thinking, okay, I can keep my kid at home and do my work. And it was like, no, you can't do that. You need childcare. So it's not a day that you're not teaching, but you do work on this day. So we need to find some childcare options, even on the days that I am not teaching.
Thinking about your book, what was something that was surprising or you learned about First Ladies that you hadn't thought about?
I felt like I knew this, but it really was illuminated. We're all different, and everybody approached the role very differently. Everybody had a different personality in terms of that. I think that sometimes maybe in it, and when I started doing the research, so we got married in 1998, I probably started doing the research probably in 2004, and then it was published it was a long time. So it sat for a while. Then I, couldn't find a publisher. So I think it was 2017. But at the time, I think sometimes the women helped me to give voice or to name stuff that I had experienced. And so one story in particular was a woman talking about friendships in the church. And it was like, yeah, it's like, and actually a couple of people talked about that. One person was, you're friendly to everyone and buddy to no one. So it's very, very hard. And I actually do have friends, especially in my old congregation, and some in the new one. I don't think anybody really would know who those people are. So, they're not we don't sit together. Nobody would ever have indication of what that is. But a couple of people really talked about being disappointed in that type of situation. So you always have to have some boundaries and really making sure that you pick people that understand this family is just like your family. We argue, we have flaws, we do things that are wrong, that don't glorify God in whatever way. I would hope that that's not who we are, but yeah, we always have that. So I think the friendship at that time when I did the interviews, it helped to give voice and to be able to label like, oh, that's why friendships in the church are weird. And I came from, like I said, I'm a church person. And so I was a young adult in my church, and that was my social network. So when I was a young adult, it was like, I'm going to church with these people and I'm hanging out with you on the weekends and I'm calling you and we're going here. And all of a sudden now, that's not the same. I can't have that same type of relationship. But yeah, you had to make people feel warmed and welcomed, that you didn't really necessarily have barriers. So that probably was the biggest thing, that sometimes people just gave me language to label what I had experienced.
What do you hope people get from your book? And if you had to do a next stage from building on that, what do you think your follow-up would be?
Well, I hope that people would get that. And at the end, I do have several questions that people can go through and have a discussion. But really, the pastors' wives are people. They are significant women, probably in the life of the ministry, even if she's not that active in the ministry. So even making sure that the pastor is like sane. And, sometimes when my husband is saying something and then he gets up in the pulpit, like, maybe he might be complaining about something. And I was like, oh, that came out much better than what I heard. So a sounding board, that's an investment in the ministry. I think the other thing is that we are just people. And then how can you relate to your pastor's wife? How can you be a support? And when I say a support, I'm saying you don't have to talk about her, or you don't have to have criticism on what she did or didn't do, because, just imagine that this was you, or criticism about her kids, or criticism about, whatever. So that's the one thing that I hope that people can take away, is really having an appreciation for these women who are supporters of the ministry, even if it's behind the scenes. And then, of course, there are women who are even more supported. And then, I'm really excited. I've had this project on the back burner probably since COVID. I really want to turn it into a play, because I think that would reach a different type of audience. So I've been in discussion with a person with theater background, and she started to write the play version of it, but then COVID hit, and I'm like, it's 2024, girl, what we gonna do? So hopefully it will come out, and that's a different type of thing, of kind of bringing those narratives off of the page and kind of alive. So I'm looking forward to that.
That was Dr. Shaunté White, professor and author of the book, The First Lady, African American Pastors' Wives in Their Own Words. To find out more about Dr. White, including accessing her book, articles, her church, and social media handles, go to this episode on our website podcast page. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology of Black Woman podcast. Be sure to check out our upcoming topics by visiting our website, psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, simply subscribe or leave a rating or review. You can also stay up to date with our upcoming episodes by following us on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks for joining us.